I came to the realization that I really like tragic stories. Characters destined to suffer just sucks me in. Watching them deal with the worst hands dealt and push through every single obstacle in their way for the slimmest chance of success or happiness while the entire world tries to beat them into submission is one of my favorite things, showing us that no matter how bad things get, there's always something worth it at the end. But then a story like Now and Then, Here and There gets recommended to me, and I definitely watched it right away and didn't forget about it for 10 months. And I think it's safe to say this is one of the most depressingly beautiful shows that I have ever seen, where the ending is much less happy than I expected originally. I don't think I really need to give a spoiler warning for a show that's over 20 years old at this point, but if you haven't heard of the show, I really think that it's something that should be watched with as little information as possible going into it to really get the full effect, so go watch it before I spoil it. Now and Then, Here and There is an unexpectedly dark isekai where the main character is an unrealistic child that gets forced into serving in an army of children, led by a crazy dictator in a foreign desert world after risking his life to save a girl he literally met minutes before they came for her. It sounds extremely stupid when I condense it to just that, but I assure you, it's only slightly stupid. It covers a lot of heavy topics like sexual violence, war, kidnapping, torture, slavery, mental and physical abuse, and probably loads of other things that might make people uncomfortable to watch it, which is something that I adore in storytelling, as it forces you to look at the more horrible things in the world to make the good moments that much better, and really makes you see what a real villain is capable of. It takes all of these horrible acts and uses them to build up the cast of characters to show what they've had to deal with and endure to reach their happy endings, even if the endings don't end up being all that happy. The story overall is extremely bleak and depressing. There's a hint of hopefulness throughout the entirety of it that tricks you into thinking that everything's going to work out in the end, which, I mean, it partly does, but the majority is either bad or extremely open with no actual conclusions. I generally like the more open endings, but in this case, it just leaves a lot more questions for me personally that I'd rather know the answers of. The only characters that have any sort of concrete ending are the ones that ended up dying, and everyone else is just stuck in this random spot with little to no actual direction of what to do from this point. The entire show had a really strange impact on me, where I found that I couldn't actually binge watch it like I normally do. Instead of watching every episode back to back, I had to take small breaks to process everything that happened in the episodes. So many things happen and change the story for better or for worse, that paired with the relatively happy and upbeat intro, and the very chill and soothing outro almost made it feel like it was forcing you to sit and think about everything that it shoved at you. But the outro specifically was such a contrasting feeling, going to something so calming from a story about horrible acts of war that it was almost jarring, and then every single episode would start with the same quote and mostly silence for the first 15 or so seconds of each episode, so it really just reinforced this moment of reflection for me. Shows normally don't get to me like this, and I'm not entirely sure if I liked it or not, but it really made me stop and think a lot more than I wanted to. There was a weird familiarity to the story that I don't really understand, but the only answer that I could come to was that it's a depiction of the horrors of a foreign war that I know nothing about, but simultaneously I know everything that I need to, because war is war. The settings and the people may change, but at the end of the day, it's all the same stuff that I've seen a million times in other shows and stories. The main character, Shu, is probably one of the most bullheaded, idiotically brave, and optimistic protagonists that I have ever seen in a show, to the point that he makes Luffy look somewhat normal. I don't think that there's a single moment in the show where he feels like an actual child, apart from the first episode where he's just normally existing and thinking about the upcoming kendo match and whether or not he's going to end up asking out a girl. But other than that, I don't think I would consider him acting like a normal person in the situation he's in. Crazy things constantly happen and he just acts like it's fairly normal and just kind of goes with the flow. It's insane. Like, these robotic snake-looking things show up and his reaction is just, oh, I guess I better leap onto it and fight like I do this all the time. It's such a weird reaction to have a child character just kind of think everything going on is relatively normal when it's really not. Like, the entire show, he just seems extremely unrealistic, and it was a bit annoying, but I still thought he was a pretty good character and just didn't let much of anything actually get to him, even when he was literally tortured multiple times. But I think he was supposed to be like 13 or 14 maybe. I can't really find anywhere that has his age age written down, apart from this random website that has him listed at about 14, so I guess he's like 13 then. But considering a vast majority of the other characters, they're basically all children, and there isn't like a single moment where Shu shows that he's a kid. You'd think that maybe he'd freak out partially about being transported into a different world and being forced into these horrible situations, but he just really doesn't at all. He hardly even questions it, and it's just a bit odd to me. But then again, he is dealing with a lot of other things at the same time, where obviously they would take more precedence, but you would think that some part of him would realize that this is not normal whatsoever. But he just continues acting like it is. But he's also extremely aware that everything that they're doing in this other world is completely wrong and unjustified. There's just a massive disconnect from him transferring worlds and not really acknowledging it whatsoever. And I don't think it would be as strange if it wasn't for Sarah's introduction, with her actually freaking out because she doesn't understand what the hell is happening and just wants to go home. She has no idea like why she's actually been taken to a foreign world and doesn't understand anything, which is a complete contrast to how Shu's character acts in the situation. But Sarah's a really interesting character that probably got the worst out of anyone else. She has some of the worst luck that I've actually seen in a show. Like, first she gets mistaken for someone else, which, I mean, that happens. But instead of letting her go, they decide to take her to a completely foreign world and lock her up and abuse her and use her to try and make more child soldiers, forcing her to commit murder to escape. And then she travels alone through the desert, only to get buried alive in a sand dune. And then Sis finds her and brings her back to the village, where she actually starts to feel a little better, only to have Shu and Lala-Ru show up, bringing up all of the memories of the abuse and horrific stuff that she had to endure, all while the boy who told her that everything was going to be alright is traveling and protecting the girl that she was mistaken for in the first place. So in her eyes, Lala-Ru is basically the entire reason she's in this situation in the first place. So I think it's understandable that she has a deep-seated hatred for Lala-Ru, but it's not really her fault that any of this happened, and it's just really unfortunate and unlucky that this happened. But then she learns that she's actually pregnant, and decides the best thing to do is to kill herself, only to then be stopped by Shu, who still insists that things are going to get better. And after going through all of that, she then gets cornered by a soldier that is infiltrated, who I assume is the father of the child. It's a bit open to interpretation, but I think it makes more sense, because he then tries to get her to run away with him by warning her that the people who held her captive and did horrible things to her, yeah, they're on their way to wipe out the entire village she's in. She then goes to warn Sis and everyone that she actually cares about to get out of the village, but ends up being hurt after witnessing Sis being shot and taken away. And after all of this stuff, she still decides to stay in that world and see what else can possibly go wrong. There's not like a ton of information about her life prior to the events of this story, but I'm going to give her the benefit of doubt and say she probably didn't deserve any of this. But considering that she chooses to stay instead of going back home, that might be an indication that whatever's waiting for her there isn't all that much better. As far as the characters go, they all have kind of dark stories, but I think Sarah's is definitely the darkest out of all of them, for just the amount of stuff she had to endure in these 13 episodes. Lala-Ru is kind of like the love interest of the show, but it's more like a damsel in distress who is meant to be saved for no actual reward. She's actually some like really old mystical god being thing or whatever that has the power to control water, and she has like a little pendant that acts as a Minecraft infinite pool of water. So that's kind of neat, I guess. But she seemingly has the power to end the war at any moment, but waited until the very last minute to really do anything. She could have just like ended the series immediately, but I think she was trying to avoid interfering as much as possible in the conflict until it ended up directly involving people she somewhat cared about, forcing her to act. She made it a point throughout the show that when she uses her powers, she grows weaker. And every time that she would actually show people what she could do, they would eventually try and use her for greed and power. So it's understandable that she didn't really want to use her powers, but I mean, she ended up doing it anyway, so we could have saved a lot of lives had she just done it in the first place and got it over with. Her character is just completely numb after everything she's been through in her extremely long life, and doesn't really show too much emotion motion in any one specific direction. I think she comes off as more of a boring character, but changing her in any way would probably ruin the character completely. And having her as the apathetic character it comes off as boring, but in her situation, I mean, anyone would probably be like that after hundreds of years of dealing with what she's had to deal with. So I can't really complain too much about her being relatively boring. All of the child soldiers were pretty much cowards, and they just really went along with their orders because it was the best chance they had to return to their homes, even though they were never returning to their homes. And it obviously resulted in being punished a lot less. And as much as I hated what they were all going along with, they're just children listening to what the adults say and trusting that they're right. So you can't really blame them for doing anything that they did, because for the most part, they're just children that don't really know any better. However, I do think that you can blame Tabul for being an absolute dick the entire time, and Nabuka for his questionable morality throughout the show. He realizes that everything's wrong, but he still goes along with them anyway, even when he has the chance to escape. I'd like to think that he was trying to do the right thing the whole time, but waiting until the right moment while simultaneously protecting all of the other children. But I'm not entirely sure about that. I think that Boo was the only soldier character that I really liked and wanted nothing bad to happen to. I did like Nabuka a lot, and his character's growth throughout the show was pretty solid. But Boo was such an innocent child that actually questioned everything from the start and tried his absolute best to do what he thought was right, even if it went against the orders he was given. I think Boo was how all of the other children would have started out. And as time went on, all of them grew more and more twisted until they became like the adults. Growing up like that has to be extremely rough on them, as they lose their entire childhood to fight a war for an absolute madman. And speaking of that madman, King Hamdo is an absolutely fantastic character in my opinion. He is basically completely insane, which pushes him past being just a good normal villain into being more of a terrifying villain in my opinion, because he's just so unpredictable. There's no telling of what he's actually capable of doing because he probably doesn't even know himself. He's completely blinded by a single goal and his ambition, and whatever else happens is of no concern to him whatsoever. He basically has no morality, and there's nothing to actually keep him grounded. He's constantly using manipulation tactics on his second-in-command, Abelia, to get her to do exactly what he wants after verbally and physically abusing her. Like, these types of villains are easily some of my favorites because of how realistically evil they seem to me. Like, he believes that he's completely in the right with everything that he does, and that anyone who thinks otherwise or opposes him is just wrong and shouldn't deserve to exist. The entire world basically revolves around him and his ideals. As far as he's concerned, he's the rightful king, and the rest of the world is just full of traitors. But he acts with a complete disregard for everything. It doesn't really matter if all of his soldiers end up dying for a pointless maneuver. He'll just kidnap more women and children and breed more soldiers if he has to. Everything he has is completely expendable to him as long as he gets what he wants. He can literally just go raid another village if he runs out of anything. As far as villains go, King Hamdo easily became one of my favorites, but specifically from a crazy madman perspective. I do really like cold, calculated villains that aren't completely batshit crazy, but there's something special about an unpredictable psycho that I just love. And some of my friends have mentioned before that I have a thing for crazy, unstable characters, and it continues to ring true. So I think that's definitely a preference thing. Now and then, here and there, definitely does a lot of things right, especially with the world building, and they never really explain much of anything at all, which is how I personally like stories to be, where it just leaves a lot open to your imagination, and the creatures and environment are just really cool in general, and leave a ton of possibilities. With all of the wild technology they possess, like, there's just so many unknowns in that world that it makes it really interesting to me. Especially with all of the random villages that feel like they're real places with their own people and lore who have their own things going on. I just want to know more about the world in general. But despite all of the good things that the story does, I still think that there's a few issues with it. Specifically with Shu's ending, where it gave almost no closure whatsoever. He ended up back home, but it really showed absolutely nothing. I wanted to see him actually return to his parents, and I wanted to know like how long he was gone, how long they've been looking for him, his reaction in general to seeing his parents after everything he had gone through. Like, are they going to believe anything that he ends up telling them? How the hell does he actually explain any of it? He's got to be filled with so much trauma at this point. Like, he's basically a ticking time bomb, and that stuff really interests me. I just can't really get behind the idea of assuming that he ends up living a normal and happy life after this. But considering how stupidly optimistic he is, I guess it's not completely out of the realm of possibilities. But I really wish they would have at least shown him reuniting with his friends or family or something to end with more of a happy ending for at least one of the characters. But leaving that open is also just a fairly good ending in my opinion. But personal preference, I would have liked to see a little bit more, even if it was just like him running home. But there's actually one thing that I really didn't understand at all in the story, and it's if they had the technology to travel between the worlds, why the hell didn't they kidnap more people from the other world for a much larger supply of soldiers? And why didn't Hamdo just bring back as much water as possible each time he went? It just really doesn't make sense that they would have and use this technology to basically do nothing with it apart from hunting down Lala-Ru, who used it in the first place to jump worlds. They could have gained so much from bringing any sort of supplies or anything back, but they just didn't. They could have even tried invading the other world instead. They just never really set any actual rules for this transportation system, so they brought things through to the other world, and everything that Shu and Sarah had on them went back to the other world. So I don't really see any actual reason why they couldn't have been able to bring more stuff through each way. Like, obviously, it's a bit unrealistic to have them send through the entirety of Hollywood, but at the same time, they could have sent some sort of vehicles through in order to bring back supplies. Or they could have sent like multiple soldiers to just bring back a couple people each time, and they could have just continuously done this. And it doesn't make sense to me that they wouldn't do that. But I also have a theory that all of the soldiers are just blindly following Hamdo's orders exactly to a T, and if they suggest anything of the sort, they'd probably be severely punished because it seems like he's the type of guy that would do that. But I think it still leaves a pretty big plot hole in the story. But I'd love to hear if other people have any thoughts on it, because it certainly seems significantly easier to just go into the other world and bring back stuff. I don't know. The older anime, in my experience at least, tend to be a lot more story driven, with a lot more interesting concepts and characters that the newer stuff just doesn't do well, typically. There's just so much more life in older work, in my opinion. The art is a bit outdated. A lot of people might see that as a massive turnoff, but I think that anime from the 90s and early 2000s in general is just superior. But that could also just be from my nostalgia from growing up with it. But with the industry as it is now, we just get a lot of crap each season with less and less gems. That's not to say that a lot of crap wasn't being produced years ago, but it definitely seems like less when looking through these rose-tinted glasses. Now and then, here and there, is just a beautifully tragic story that will probably make most people uncomfortable to watch, but they'll be glad that they did. Thanks for watching.